All right. Thank you everyone for joining us today here at Paris Blockchain Week, coming to you virtually through your computer screen. Sorry we couldn't be there in person, maybe next year. Joining me today are three of the most brilliant minds in our industry. Three people who need no introduction, yet that is my job. But first, a little bit about me. I'm David Wachsman, founder and CEO of Wachsman, the largest strategic communications firm in our industry. I'll start with some introductions. Arthur Breitman of Tezos, founder. Hello, Emin of Nomadic Labs and Cornell, and Ben Livshits of Brave, among many other remarkable accomplishments so far in his career. Gentlemen, we have a lot to discuss, and we only have 40 minutes or so, so we're going to go around a lot of topics. But we're going to start by first saying what the topic title is, which is what's been built in 2020, essentially a tech update. This is important to note because, of course, right now we're at the evident beginnings of what looks like a market run in the crypto asset sector. Bitcoin 19,000, et cetera. A lot of eyes are paying attention to the space now. Many of whom, people I should say, who basically lost confidence in the space in 2018 and 2019. What's actually been built? Arthur, why don't you tell us a little bit about fruit coins, one of the things that have been most popular in the sector so far?
Yeah, fruit coins. Well, I would put this as a counter example. I think a lot of the attention around like what was being built, what I like to call fruit coins. You know, there's yams and there's potatoes and there's like eggplants, and they've been basically a breed of tokens where you have a governance token for a decentralized exchange. And what you do is that if you stake this governance token to give more liquidity for the governance token, you get more governance token. And what are you going to do with it? You're going to exchange it on another DEX for another governance token for a lending protocol. So it's kind of like this entire circular thing, and it kind of have a bloom. I think people had a lot of fun with it. And there is some cool technology behind it, you know, to be sure. But I would say that if we look at what's been built, it's not something that's really here to stay. It's a fun phase, and we've gone through a lot of fun phases in this industry. But I hope that we're going to talk about the more substantial stuff which have been built this year.
We certainly will. Goon, I guess we'll start with you on this. Let's talk a little bit about DeFi. It's one of the major themes of this year that people have been talking a lot about. And Avalanche, in many ways, has been formed to help DeFi projects in a more regulatory compliant way. Fruit coins, of course, being the, well, as you said, a counterexample. Goon, can you tell us a little bit about maybe your perspective on that phenomenon and how you're building something to support DeFi?
Sure. So let me handle the last two questions. I think one of the main things that got built this year was Avalanche, the third big approach to consensus that we've seen in the entire history of my field, distributed systems. So it's a very big step forward, and suddenly we have a new blockchain that can achieve performance without really high performance to rival or exceed Visa without actually centralizing. In fact, while being more decentralized than any other protocol before it. So that's one of the biggest things that happened in 2020. And at the same time, it was coincident with the rise of interest in DeFi. And one of the issues that you see, I'm not talking about the fruit coins that are sort of self-referential, et cetera, and inwards looking. But one of the things that you see, if you talk to anybody with an asset of value in their hand that they'd like to digitize, be it corporate debt, be it something like equities, be it anything else, bonds, whatever else, what they would like to do is have full control over the full life cycle of an asset. And chains that existed until very recently gave you control over, some of them just gave you one token and no control, like Bitcoin. Others, like Tezos and other smart contract platforms, give you the ability to create as many tokens as you like and give you flexibility over their behavior. What Avalanche does that's different from all of this is it also gives you control over the network. You can define which nodes can participate in the upkeep of which subchains that you like in an idea that we call subnetworks. And this in turn gives us the ability to create tokens that are backed by nodes in a certain jurisdiction. They have legal backing. And that is a very different state of affairs. And I think this is the enabler to a large class of new digitized assets where the asset issuer can maintain control over the participants to the system post-release.
And so what you'll have actually, therefore, is an environment where one can create regulated assets. which is going to be very important for the growth of this in other sectors. Arthur, I'm about to ask you actually a serious question this time. I had to start with that fun joke. But Tezos has been famous for its evolution this year. You've seen a lot of tech progress, and I know that there are some things on the horizon. Why don't you give us a bit of an update on Tezos so far?
Yeah, so in terms of what has been built, this year has seen two major upgrades to the Tezos blockchain. The upgrades canonically are named after cities. So the very first upgrade was Athens, followed by Babylon. And just in 2020, we had the car stage upgrade and the Delphi upgrade just last month. And the Delphi upgrade was mostly a large increase in the throughput capacity of the execution engine for the smart contract. So we can run 4 times more smart contract per block now than we were able to before, and that's gone through a lot of optimization of the virtual machine. But what's more exciting, I think, is there's an upgrade right now called Edo, which is being voted upon. And one of the features that it introduces is that it uses a technology that was first developed in Zcash called sapling, which lets you have privacy-preserving transaction. But so on Zcash, you can have shielded transaction, they call with the Zcash token. What we've done is that instead of trying to say, oh, Tezos will have shielded transaction, we put it directly into the smart contract language, which means anyone who creates a token on Tezos has the benefit of being able to have this selective privacy. And the notion of privacy is that you don't have to broadcast to the entire world what your transaction is. You can select who you want to disclose it to. So you want to disclose it to your auditors, you might want to disclose it to regulators or tax authorities, but you don't want to disclose it to your competitors. Especially if you're trading, for example, you don't want to disclose it that you're taking a position in some equity, for example, to other funds. And I think that's a very, very important feature that's being rolled out in this new protocol. And it's actually something, when you think of privacy, oftentimes we think of the cypherpunk ethics of blockchain and cryptocurrency, and that's certainly a big part of it. But I've noticed that a lot of the demand for having private transactions actually come from institutional actors who want to tokenize securities on chain.
Well, certainly we saw, in fact, that zero-knowledge proofs were being investigated by JP Morgan. This was a number of years ago when they were trying to integrate that into Quorum, among others, and whether they succeeded or not is up for discussion. Ben, tell us a little bit about what's happening at Brave. You recently surpassed 20 million active users. This is a remarkable achievement anywhere, and in the blockchain sector at all. I mean, that's perhaps unparalleled.
Very happy to do that. I'd like to actually, before I go there, let me offer a bit of a spirited defense of those, food coins, because I feel like they really don't get any proper publicity here. So look, I mean, slightly more seriously, outside of the investment excitement, outside of chasing yield and yield farming and all these things which we've seen during the DeFi summer, I think in a certain more technological sense, these activities in DeFi offer one of the first glimpses of a range of, I guess what we used to call dApps, back in 2016, 17, 18, and so on and so forth. And as a cohort of dApps, I think this is actually quite impressive because the level of maturity we see for some of these protocols is actually quite impressive. Some of these protocols, like for example, Aave we're looking at the other day, they've gone through, say 8 or so audits. They're really quite serious about development practices and whatnot. And despite some of the hacks we've seen there, frankly, I'm genuinely quite impressed by some of the things there. Not all, but some of them are fairly interesting. So back to Brave. So we actually, I think 2 days ago, we hit 22 million monthly users. So that's really quite exciting, which means, well, a whole number of things, actually. So one of the things it implies is that we are well outside of the early adopter circle, right? So we are not only catering to users who care about crypto, we're not only catering to users who care about their privacy and preserving their privacy and ad blocking and things like that you get in Brave out of the gate. We really care to, we really cater to a much wider demographic, which means that we can be both, in a sense, we cannot be too crazy about what we do because we need to care, we need to worry about what happens to the user base and things like that. But I think it also gives us a little bit of room for experimentation. Like, for example, in our nightly build, we are a little bit more liberal about what we actually ship, and we kind of sometimes, we don't end up liking what we ship, and so we pull it back in, things like that. So I think it's an excellent kind of experimentation platform as well. So the way I think about in the context of crypto, and I'm happy to tell you a little bit more about what we actually have built on the crypto backend side, which I think is quite exciting. But In a sense, I think Brave is, I mean, the browser really in general is the end user's gateway to the web, right? And that includes Web 1.0. That includes Web 2.0 as well. And of course, the up and coming Web 3.0, we are there to serve as a gateway, as a window to that as well. So I'm happy to tell you about some of the features we've built in the browser, things related to crypto wallets and some of the ideas we have there, and some of the other ways we are thinking about in terms of engaging with the end user, including things like, for example, e-commerce, which might be up and coming, things of that sort. But let me stop here, and I'll add to that story a little bit later.
Certainly, we'll be covering many of these sectors. That actually does lead very well into our next conversation, which is about Web3. Arthur and Gun, you two gentlemen are some of the architects of the infrastructure that's going to drive Web3. Arthur, you've made a lot of observations and predictions essentially about what Web3 might look like. Would you care to tell us a little bit about how Web3 is going to truly differentiate from Web 2? What does that actually mean?
I'm open-minded about Web3. I'm not fully on board. I think there's different type of vision that exists in this ecosystem. There are people very close to Bitcoin who see that, money is the only app, and Bitcoin is going to be the only money, and that's it. Very, very, very money-centric. You have another camp, which is to say, no, programmable money is where it's at. Smart contracts, financial applications. So basically, have decentralized finance. And it's funny. So we were talking about Fruitcoin. One thing I deplore is that for me, decentralized finance is what this is about. And it used to be that when you said decentralized finance, it meant things like algorithmic stable coins. It meant things like lending, like decentralized insurance and prediction market. That is decentralized finance. That's great. And I'm kind of sad that decentralized finance DeFi has come to mean this like drivel, because it used to be about something that's really real and really important. Now the Web3 use case is a little different. It's less about programmable value. It's how people interact with the web. It's how they manage their identity and so on and so forth. I am open-minded about it. I come from the world of finance. I spent 10 years in quant finance as a market maker. This is what I know. This is what I understand. I see a very strong product market fit in terms of having decentralized, secure blockchains for these applications. I'm less sure about the Web3. I'm open, and there are teams in the Tezos ecosystem, like Spruce, for example, which are working on this. And by all means, the beauty of an open platform is you can have different people with different vision build on it. But to speak about the Web3 vision, I think I understand the nuts and bolts in terms of technology that you need. You need a lot of scalability. You need external systems for storing data. You need to have really good standards. You need to have a tremendously good integration with web frameworks. So I understand all that. I'm a little less certain that this is going to be the dominant use case, as some people seem to be.
Well, certainly, and I want to talk about what you may believe is the really important part of blockchain technology, which is the evolution of money and money-related systems. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But Gun, I'd like to get your perspective on Web3 and essentially adding value in some way, shape, or form, and a decentralization in more form to the web, to the way consumers and users experience the internet.
So sure, let me try to step back a moment and give everyone the Web3 vision. So the idea here is that by using a better technological foundation, we can keep the web service providers, the websites that we interact with, the Facebooks, the Googles, etc. of the world, to a tighter standard. So in the old days, that is, until now and even today, when you interact with a website, you are unconditionally trusting the person on the other end of that web connection. You're trusting that they don't leak your data. You're trusting that they don't collect your data. You're trusting that they do with your information what you tell them to do. And the Web3 vision is, by using crypto and related technologies, we can step away from that. You could still use Facebook, but you can keep Zuckerberg from peeking inside, for example, your status updates, right? So he can serve it to your friends without knowing what's in there. Is this possible? Technologically, it's becoming possible. So at any one time, we have technologies that show us the future, that give us a glimpse. And we've seen the glimpse, right? Bitcoin, Ethereum, and sort of the stuff that's been built and said around those have given us an idea of what we could do. It's no longer the old days. You do not have to unconditionally trust Zuckerberg. And that's, I think, the real key thing to take away. Now, is it possible to actually compete with the Facebooks of the world with today's technologies? And I would say until recently, it was a pipe dream. Right. So if you try to use Ethereum, for example, for Web3 activities, you would click on a button. You would have to wait at least 14 seconds for the first confirmation. And that's a non-starter. And now we're beginning to have systems that can confirm in less than a second. So Avalanche is achieving about 300 millisecond latencies on the mainnet today. And that is unprecedented. It's very, very, very fast. And what does that enable you to do? Well, suddenly now we are somewhat competitive with actually interactive systems. I never thought we would see the day, but now we've seen the day. Can we scale further? Yes, there are other technologies coming down the pipeline. And I'm so very bullish on Web3. It is not going to be overnight. We're going to see the very first adopters begin to build small things at first, and then maybe games, but then from there, blossom onto bigger, greener pastures. And so in the 5 to 10 year frame, Web3 is going to be a big dominant use case for many applications where you don't want to trust the other side, where you don't want to give out your personal information.
Well, Ben, you've done a lot of research into this, and you also explore kind of what this means from a UX perspective, and how do users actually behave kind of in this new environment. Brave, in many ways, is a bridge to Web3. Tell us a little bit about your research, some of the findings that you've had for this larger audience.
Well, look, so I mean, the vision of protecting the user, being the trusted user agent, is obviously near and dear to our heart. This is what we've been building at Brave for, over 4 years now, right? I mean, ultimately, every bit of research you find in this space shows that, in average users, while they genuinely align with the goals of privacy, they're not likely to go too far out of their way to achieve those goals. And so, things have to work in a way that's utterly and effectively seamless, right, for them to take advantage of these kinds of things. So, the ad blocking that works out of the gate without the need to configure anything, that's one example of such a thing, as well as fingerprinting prevention, all of these other bells and whistles that we've been building into Brave over the years. But going back to the topic of Web3, so look, it's different people have different definitions of what it is in the first place. For some people, it's the use of MetaMask with the likes of Compound and such, right? In a sense, that's a Web3 interaction. And while there have been estimates out there, actually, I think about 4 or 5 months ago, we've seen some estimates on the number of people who actually are in the space of DeFi, the number of wallets at least. We cannot really estimate the number of people properly because we cannot do deduplication. But ultimately, it appears at least to be actually higher than what one might have thought. And so that's an interesting observation. But again, that's not really a mass scale phenomenon, at least at the moment. And while I'm sympathetic with the goals of decentralizing things like social networks over time, traditionally it's been actually a fairly difficult thing to do. We've seen attempts to do that with Twitter and Facebook and whatnot. And it's been relatively hard to kind of get to that. So as a bridge, ultimately, we sort of need to make sure that we are open-ended, and we are on the cutting edge of things, especially when it comes to basically getting the end user closer to what ends up being Web 3.0. But we cannot, we need to also make sure that the wheels don't fall off the bus, right? So there is quite a lot to do in terms of upkeep, if you will, to make sure that things are working. And I think there's much to be said about combining those financial scenarios, which sometimes what people sometimes refer to as the web of value, and I quite like that term actually personally. And some of these scenarios at Brave have to do with, for example, the following, right? So we've built the first privacy-preserving advertising ecosystem that actually does ad matching and delivery on the client, and so by doing so doesn't violate the end user privacy, but is also something that actually rewards the user using the basic attention token cryptocurrency BAT, and that's turning an old model that's been around for 20 years or something on its head, and that's an interesting experiment. We have many more users now than we had even a couple of months ago on that platform, and this allows us to experiment in a certain way, in a certain sense, in real time with this kind of value delivery. But again, so we're going well outside of those people who play in the DeFi space. We're going and taking this to the masses, so to speak, at least at the scale that we currently have. But then there are, of course, other things, like, for example, I mentioned e-commerce in passing is something that we'd like to enable. And another scenario that we are quite fond of is that of paid content, right? So things like, articles behind paywalls, right? And so we've done studies, we've run web crawls where we look at the top 1,000 websites, and we discover that easily over 50% of what we see is behind some sort of a paywall, right? And so getting access to high quality content is also, I think, ultimately part of our mission, because if people can only read what's for free, the quality of that sometimes is not so great. And so how do we reconcile that with the ability of many, many wallets now that hold back to basically, compensate publishers, including publishers, news publishers, that is to say, and how do we create this kind of virtual cycle within the ecosystem and make it move a little bit faster? I think that's been our goal. Now, I'll be the first one to admit that when it comes to partnering with non-crypto partners, things take a lot longer. It's relatively easy to partner up with somebody in crypto, right?
Media companies
come again?
I was saying media companies certainly have slow sales cycles, and they're not.
That's one example of that.
Businesses. Yes. And we've seen certainly that media have, for instance, and kind of changing the topic of this a little bit, media companies, and my vantage point, have been covering this industry to some extent along the lines of Bitcoin market price. It's not fair. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But certainly when Bitcoin's doing well, we've seen more attention. When Bitcoin's not doing well, it tends to be that fewer and fewer reporters are covering the space. Arthur, you got into this in part because of Bitcoin, but I would like to get your stance on it. Is Bitcoin perfect?
No. I think that's uncontroversial. I think even the most hardcore Bitcoiner would not go ahead and say that that Bitcoin is perfect. I think the main question is is it the biggest question is is it good enough? And if it's good enough, it may not matter that it's perfect. So in terms of if you look at Bitcoin as a store of value as a form of digital gold, certainly a lot of the Bitcoin enthusiasts hope to see Bitcoin replace gold, and the way that Bitcoin supposedly replaces gold is by being technologically superior, because it's easier to self-custody than gold. You cannot easily put gold under your mattress safely, whereas with multi-signature you can actually have quite a lot of safety with self-custody. It's easier to transmit, so you have a lot of technological advantage to Bitcoin, which might give it an edge over sufficient edge over gold, despite the massive history of gold as a store of value. Now the question is that certainly Bitcoin was probably the first certainly the first successful cryptocurrency by any means, and I think there's been clearly technological improvement over what Bitcoin has proposed. I think having smart contracts, for example, is a particularly useful feature if you want to have money, having programmable money, and having more interesting way of programming it is clearly a feature, and also it enables scalability solutions, layer 2 solutions, and so on and so forth. The Lightning Network, which is very cherished by the Bitcoin network, is a lot easier to develop if you have a smart contract language than if you have Bitcoin script. I think privacy is extremely important. What saddens me a little bit is that the Bitcoin space has moved. In 2013, there was this look at this innovation in altcoin, and the language was saying, look, it doesn't matter. All these altcoins are basically test nets for Bitcoin. We will take the best of whatever they do, and Bitcoin will evolve, and Bitcoin will incorporate all of that. And then that language became progressively, all these ideas are bad, and actually having smart contracts is a bad idea. It makes you insecure, or it makes you bad in some way, and privacy is also bad. And there's been a lot of rationalization of the design choices in Bitcoin, and an abandonment of a desire to innovate, and I find it a little sad. So it's not perfect. It may be good enough. It's quite possible, but I'm not sure.
So then, how are you innovating at Tezos and elsewhere? How are you seeing money innovate and evolve?
Well, the idea of Tezos is precisely to have meta innovation in some sense. You don't want to say, okay, we're going to have a better network, and it's going to be better because it's going to have feature X and Y and Z. Because pretty soon you have more innovation. And the approach that many cryptocurrencies have, that they're going to have some sort of central entity which is going to push the new version. They're going to say, okay, here's a new version, and everyone hard fork. Everyone change your client. Here's a new version. Install a new client. And in theory, in theory, they'll say, well, we don't hold power because anyone could just refuse to not upgrade. They could not install this upgrade. Now, the problem is that in a network of value, as opposed to a software, if it's just software that you're forking, it's not a problem. In a network of value, you cannot fork value. You cannot just, if you have a coin which has, a $10 billion market cap, and you fork it, you don't get two $10 billion market cap coin. One is going to succeed, the other one is not. And as a node operator, you want to be following the one that's going to succeed. So you end up with a dynamic that has nothing to do with merit, but everything to do with expectation. And so because of the Schelling point, a lot of power can be wielded by a small group. And so I didn't want that. I didn't want Tezos to evolve just because someone would have enough clout to make it evolve. In some sense, either someone has enough clout to make it evolve and that's a source of centralization, or no one does, and that's a source of early ossification. You don't want that. How do we solve this? We solve this with on-chain governance. We solve it with a procedure whereby the people who actually hold tokens on the network, or who are using the network, can vote and say, okay, we want this upgrade, or we don't want this upgrade. You have a choice, and there's no penalty for saying, I don't want this upgrade. If you go with the wrong fork, there's a huge penalty for that. You don't want to bet on the wrong fork, but there's no penalty for saying, look, I don't think this is a good idea, and being in a minority or in the majority. And that's, I think, is the important part of it. How do you allow a protocol to innovate over time to basically fulfill the promise that I think Bitcoin was making around 2013, 2014, which is to say every other coin is a test net for us. And I think every other blockchain is a test net for Tezos, because ultimately, everything that's being innovated in other chains, if it's robust and if it adds value to its users, can be, and I think ultimately will be ported into Tezos, and that's the vision.
I've seen Joe Lubin make a similar argument when it comes to Ethereum. Not always has Ethereum.
Ethereum, you have to hard fork when Vitalik got hard fork. I mean, you don't have to, but if you don't, you're going to be on the minority fork.
And well, we've seen ETC, right? Goon, tell us kind of how you see forking. What does that mean, and kind of how does Avalanche approach this issue?
Let's see. So I think Arthur mentioned the issues with governance. If you issue a coin or build a system without governance, you end up getting some default governance system that's typically hidden, that's typically hard to penetrate, that's typically revolving around certain personalities, as opposed to something that's out in the open. So I see one of the biggest innovations in Tezos as being this governance mechanism where you bring it all out into the open, and you allow anybody to participate in the evolution of their financial future. This is really key. And in Avalanche, we essentially took the exact same idea, but we made it a bit more limited than the version in Tezos. So there are certain parameters in Avalanche that are open to governance, and some that are not. So for example, the number of maximum coins to be issued, that is not something that is up for governance. But the rate at which you issue this thing is up for governance, and it should depend on external macro climate. So if the macroeconomy at the moment requires us to provide reward rates that are very high, then we should be able to raise them. In any case, we should be able to determine how we approach that maximum cap depending on what the users are saying. And that is a way to build a decentralized system that is in the hands of the people that it serves. And that, I think, is the biggest differentiator between the second wave systems like Avalanche, like Tezos and others that have governance built in, versus everything else that came before them, where all of the policies for all time have to be baked into the system on day zero. I think the chances of such a system succeeding are very, very small. What are the chances that anybody can make a 5-year plan, let alone a 50-year plan, let alone a 500-year plan? Those things are destined to fail. And so you need some mechanism by which you can tweak these parameters. And that's what we do in Avalanche with coin-based voting.
Arthur, I want to give you some time to chat a little bit about Web3 and give us any additional.
Oh, no. I just wanted to react to what Good was saying. So I'm all on board with it. Having a decentralized Facebook or decentralized Google or all these services. And my first foray in the internet was Usenet. Usenet was federated discussion forums. It's been kind of killed by the Twitters of the world, and I don't think they're much better. But I don't think that the obstacles for having decentralized social networks and all of this have been technical, to be honest. And one thing that's important, I like to say that blockchains are like statefulness into a stateless world. And what I mean by that is that you have two kinds of data structures in computer science. You have immutable data structure and immutable data structure. An immutable data structure doesn't change. You can add to it, but you never edit it. And so a good example of an immutable data structure is Twitter. On Twitter, you cannot really edit a tweet, or even if you delete it, you mark it as deleted, but it's still kind of there. So you just add and add and add and add. That is an immutable data structure. Blockchains are immutable, but the big trick of blockchain the innovation that you use an immutable data structure to represent mutation. Because when you make a payment, when I pay you, the money was mine, and now it's yours. The state has changed. This is a mutation. And blockchain, and in order to do mutations, you need to have consensus. You need to have all this machinery, which is expensive, perhaps less expensive with Avalanche, but it's still, it's still a lot of machinery that you need to have this. For most social networks, you don't actually need to have mutability. You're perfectly fine with mutability. And I think historically the reason decentralized alternatives to these have failed. Do you remember, what was it called? Diaspora, which was supposed to be the decentralized Facebook. There have been many attempts, and Usenet has been abandoned, and Jabber has been, remember using Jabber with the plugins to get private messages, and now it's all Signal. I think the reason they have failed has been, one is spam prevention has been difficult. Funding has been difficult. Spam prevention, and I would say one of the key features of these very large companies is algorithmic curation. The fact that when you search, your Facebook feed is heavily curated. That's not just spam. That's also that's also the content. Maybe not the one that you want to see, but at least the one you're going to engage with. And that's very, very hard to replicate. And certainly there are problems with the algorithmic curation that these companies are doing. Absolutely, but the solution is not to replace it with nothing. And it's been very hard in this decentralized world to come up with this. And certainly it can be run client side, but it's a massive effort to develop this type of tools. And I think that's what we're missing is this, and not necessarily like a better blockchain for having this decentralized web.
Yes, Ben, of course. I would love to hear from you on the application side.
So let me just make a couple of comments on what was just said. I mean, look, we know, I think, almost for a fact that it's really difficult to do proper fraud detection. It's really fairly challenging to provide a high quality of service rate with availability guarantees and things like that in a decentralized system as well. Not always, but often it is. So certainly, I mean, let's say in advertising, fraud is a major part, and we've really struggled to decentralize that part, and we still, I would argue, don't really know a proper solution to that. I think it's really quite difficult. On the governance front, I mean, let me just make a couple of comments there. So look, I mean, obviously we want to make systems that are future-proof and are relatively nimble when it comes to changing circumstances. But at the same time, I would also posit that I don't think effectively we have more unsolved problems around governance than I think we have solved problems. We've been watching what's been happening in the governance space with the protocols, Compound, and Balance and Union and things like that. And I mean, while the mechanics have been worked out, there's nothing particularly complicated about that. I mean, pretty much all of them have a fairly high level of consolidation around voting power, and if these are VC-backed, then it's not surprising that the initial VCs would have quite a lot of voting power that would, permeate the rest of the discussion. It's very rare that these things are suddenly shifted around and shaken up, but that generally doesn't happen. And so one could argue, well, is this really governance, or is this just a different form of a corporate board effectively on which these VCs are there with an observer status or something. So, I mean, this is just one example of, governance being effectively a hard problem. I'm not actually, making any accusations here at all. I'm just pointing out that it's really difficult to make this, sensible or, for that matter, efficient, right? So we've seen people, tweaking these collateral parameters to be, let's say 40%, sounds like a nice number. And then 60%. Well, clearly, if you use mathematics, you'd probably come up with a number that's not divisible by 10, right? I mean, if you're trying to optimize for something. But, if humans are, mucking around with these numbers, then 40% sounds pretty good, and 60% probably sounds kind of okay, too.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's intriguing, right, to observe this. But I think ultimately, as I said before, we have more problems to solve than the number of problems that have been solved thus far around governance. That is.
Absolutely. If I may chime in just to follow up on what Arthur said, I think there is always some irrational exuberance when it comes to Web3 issues. People look at something like, let's say, Google, and all they see is the search engine. And they're like, oh, I wonder if I can build a decentralized search engine. And as Arthur points out, it is not the search engine, the decentralized version, that's really the difficult challenge. I can build a decentralized search engine, no problem. It's really all of the other things that Google does behind the scenes that you have no idea about. That is actually hard to build in this new Web3 environment. So what are those things? Spam control, suggestions, algorithmic curation, etc., etc. There are gazillion things of this kind that are often not visible to the layman's eye. So in the blockchain space, we've had very naive approaches to decentralization to Web3. A Web3 approach without a funding model, for example, I'm sure Ben will chime in and say, that's a non-starter. That's, okay, so you got rid of the funding model, well, you got to put something else in place for that service to be operational in perpetuity. So there's a whole lot of things that need to go into the design of a Web3 service. That's why I said it's going to take 5 to 10 years. But the problems I see, Arthur, that we cited, the invisible stuff that these companies do, they are not insurmountable. They're possible to do according to other models and in a decentralized fashion. So I'm super bullish in the area still, but with the caveat that these sort of naive, starry-eyed ideas of, oh, we're going to undo Google and we're going to replace it with some kind of a Web3 blockchain indexing thingy, those are just not going to happen.
I've only got a few minutes left with you, gentlemen. So first thing I want to, 2 topics, and this is kind of, let's call it lightning round. The first is central bank digital currencies. We have seen a lot of conversation about that this year in 2020. Arthur, let's start with you. Are they taking off, and what type of tech are they going to be built on?
I think we have the technology. So I know that a company in the Tezos ecosystem in France called Nomadic Labs, and they've been working on several CBDC projects. One, for example, with Forge, Société Générale, and the Banque de France that they've been working on. So there's a few of these projects. I think there's actually a few CBDCs which are live in the world. I think it's inevitable. Like we already have money which is largely digital, and having better cryptographic control on that money will inevitably come. I don't know exactly what form it will take, but it will come. I don't know if they're going to be using public blockchains, private blockchains, or even not necessarily blockchains at all, or different ledgers. But I think it's pretty inevitable, and it's the way that I think like central bankers are also thinking. It's just a natural evolution of banking software.
Goon, I would like to see your quick take, and then my final question.
Sure. I love CBDCs. I see them not as a usable thing for me necessarily, but as a growing baby step from the traditional establishment. So we should cheer them on. I've spoken to more central bankers than I care to count even. More than 6, 7 central banks have come to us in the last year or so, all spurred by the Chinese innovation in this space. I expect much more. For the lay public, I think these things may or may not offer a value proposition, but in every case, we have to applaud the central bankers taking these steps, and I'm looking forward to the announcements on top of Avalanche as well in this domain.
Last question, and this is simply a yes/no, starting with you, Ben. Is it winner take all when it comes to layer ones?
No.
Okay. Goon, winner take all when it comes to layer ones? Yes or no?
No. Rising tide lifts all boats.
Arthur?
No, it depends what you mean by layer one. So there's kind of like 2 views of the coin at layer one. There's a view of like your money, and maybe your programmable money, but your money in some sense, right? And there's another view which is no, your smart contract platform. You're here to power like dApps.
Platform, yeah.
You exist for, and it's not winner. I would say in this space it's not necessarily winner take all, but it's like I don't really think there's going to be a win in this space to begin with. And the problem being that, essentially, the reason that application platform can be successful today is paradoxically because of the lack of scalability. Because you have a lack of scalability, you have very tight constraints on what you can run, and a lot of people want to run these decentralized applications, and as a result, it creates a squeeze on transaction fees. It creates demand, and that will be the case. But I don't think these problems are insurmountable. And as you surmount this problem, the value of this network, and especially with interoperability of those things, the value of this network is going to fall not to the value of the computation, but to the margin you get from this computation.
Arthur, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We're running very much at the end of our time.
Yeah, it's not a high margin business. I don't think being in depth. I think it's cool dApps are cool, but like from a rent extraction perspective, I don't want to be in the dApp business.
All right. Well, thank you all, gentlemen, very much for coming on here. It has been an extraordinary conversation here at Paris Blockchain Week. Thank you, Ben, Arthur, and Goon, for your insights. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all. Take care.